In the frozen darkness of the Ypres salient in early 1916, the Western Front held more secrets than the soldiers fighting along it would ever fully understand. Few know that in a narrow stretch of trench held by the British 1st Battalion, Royal Warwickshire Regiment, a night patrol vanished without a single trace left behind. Their disappearance became one of the most quietly discussed mysteries among officers who already carried far too many burdens in a war defined by chaos and mud. But what set this event apart was not merely that men were lost, it was how they were lost, and the strange, methodical silence they left behind. The conditions were brutal. The winter rains had turned communication trenches into waist-deep channels of sludge, and the front lines were continually shaken by artillery blasts that carved new landscapes overnight. Still, night patrols were routine, almost mechanical. Men went over the top or slipped through saps to listen for enemy movement, check wire breaks, and watch for German raiding parties. On the night of February 18, 1916, a 4-man listening patrol was ordered forward. They were experienced soldiers from B Company, Lance Corporal Edward Hales, Privates Conley, Farrow, and Atteridge, men known for their discipline. They should have returned within the hour. Instead, they disappeared into the damp night as if the earth itself had swallowed them. When dawn broke, their rifles and equipment were found neatly stacked at the trench's firing step, an arrangement that made no tactical sense. No patrol left weapons behind. To do so was to step into enemy territory unarmed, an unthinkable act in the contested ground between lines. Sergeant William Portman, the platoon's senior NCO, later wrote in his field diary, "Their gear sat dry, arranged with intention. No mud streaks, no scuffing, as if placed, not dropped." This single detail would cast doubt over every conventional explanation proposed afterwards. Initially, officers suspected a German snatch team. Trench raids were common, designed to gather prisoners or intelligence, but such raids were almost always accompanied by violence, shelling to mask movement, flares or screams carried on the wind. None of these were heard that night. And if the Germans had taken the men, why leave their carefully arranged equipment? Commanders next considered the possibility of a collapsed shell hole or camouflaged pit. The terrain around Ypres was treacherous. New craters opened constantly, often water-filled and deep. Search parties probed the surrounding ground at first light, using poles to check for soft patches or sudden drops. They found nothing. The area had been shelled, yes, but not enough to bury 4 men without debris or visible disruption. Adding to the unease were conflicting accounts from nearby sentries. One man from C Company insisted he heard faint voices shortly after the patrol departed, short phrases too muffled to be understood. Another claimed he saw a brief, low flicker of light ahead of no man's land, unusual for a front where any illumination invited enemy fire. Yet neither report matched what investigators found: a still, untouched stretch of devastated earth. Historical context only deepens the puzzle. German units facing the Royal Warwickshires at that time, elements of the 111th Reserve Infantry Regiment, were not known for aggressive night operations in that sector. Captured documents and later post-war interviews never reference the capture of a British patrol on February 18th. No propaganda leaflets boasted of prisoners, no Red Cross lists included the missing men. In official records, they simply ceased to exist. In the battalion war diary, the entry for that day is unusually terse. Patrol of 4 failed to return. Search conducted at first light. No trace discovered. Given how meticulous British record-keeping typically was, the sparse wording stands out. Some historians argue the brevity reflects embarrassment, a desire to avoid encouraging rumors or lowering morale. Others suggest it indicated genuine confusion, an inability to frame the event within the bounds of normal trench warfare. Modern military analysts have tried to interpret the clues. One theory holds that the patrol may have reached an uncharted section of trench or a collapsed sap and fallen into a hidden cavity. Another suggests a rapid enemy extraction through communicating tunnels, the kind used extensively in mining sectors. But none of these theories explain the stacked rifles, objects that should have been muddied, damaged, or missing entirely if violence or collapse had played a role. What remains is a fragment of wartime history. 4 men, experienced and disciplined, stepping into the night on a routine assignment and evaporating from the record. For the soldiers who continued fighting in the same trenches, the disappearance left a quiet, unsettling mark. If 4 armed men could vanish on familiar ground, what else could happen in the sprawling labyrinth of the Western Front? And as rumors spread from platoon to platoon, officers began to worry this was not an isolated case. Other units across the Western Front had their own stories: missing runners, vanished engineers, patrols swallowed by noise and darkness. The Ypres incident would become the first thread in a larger tapestry of unexplained losses, soon to be examined. In July 1916, as the Battle of the Somme raged with unrelenting ferocity, the Western Front became a labyrinth of shattered trenches, crater fields, and broken communications. Few people today realize that American military personnel, though the United States had not yet officially entered the war, were already present in small liaison and observation roles. Their mission was to study British and French operations, learn the evolving realities of industrialized warfare, and quietly prepare for the possibility that America might one day be drawn into the conflict. It was during one such quiet liaison assignment that 2 U.S. Army runners disappeared under circumstances that baffled both American and British officers. Another incident that, like the Ypres disappearance months earlier, left no bodies, no gear, and no conclusive explanation. The event occurred on July 14, 1916, in the battered lines east of Contalmaison. The U.S. 1st Division Liaison Detachment, attached to the British 21st Division, had been positioned near forward observation posts to monitor how messages moved through the chaos of an active offensive. Communications were everything at the Somme. Lines were cut repeatedly by German shell fire, and runners were often the only reliable way to transmit orders between scattered positions. 2 American soldiers, Corporal Richard Lowell and Private James Merritt, were assigned to carry updated position reports to a nearby British company headquarters, a short run across familiar trench sectors. They left just after noon. The struggle was the terrain itself. The Somme battlefield at that time looked less like farmland and more like a lunar surface. Shells had obliterated every recognizable landmark, creating deep, overlapping craters that filled with water and hid beneath drifting smoke. Trenches collapsed under their own weight, and communication routes changed by the hour. As the men departed, British observers noted that they were calm, confident, and moving along a trench line that had been stable for at least 2 days. There was nothing unusual: no enemy barrage, no reported gas alarms, nothing to suggest they were walking into danger. But they never reached the receiving post. When the British unit radioed back 2 hours later asking for the updated message, confusion spread quickly. The Americans had departed well before the designated delivery deadline. A search team was assembled immediately. They expected to find the runners trapped by shelling, injured in debris, or sheltering in a dugout. Instead, they found an empty trench, undisturbed ground, and no trace of movement beyond the point where the men were last seen. Not a rifle, not a pack, not a scrap of paper from the message they carried. A British officer, Captain Henry Darlow, recorded in his log, "Ground had not been recently struck. No shell impact, no cave-in, no struggle. Simply no sign." His phrasing echoes eerily the diary entries from the earlier Ypres disappearance. To understand the mystery, historians must look at the broader context. The Somme's trench networks were notoriously confusing, but they were also heavily mapped. Every communication trench was named, sketched, and updated daily. The route Lowell and Merritt were expected to take was not only known, it was one of the safest available. Yet during the investigation, one detail puzzled officers. A small, uncharted lateral trench discovered by the search party appeared to break away from the main route roughly 70 meters from the start. The trench was shallow, partially collapsed, and contained old German timber supports. It did not appear on any British maps. The question arose, did the Americans accidentally take this side path? Statements from soldiers nearby conflicted. One gunner swore he heard footsteps and muted conversation drifting from that direction earlier in the afternoon, though he could not confirm the voices belonged to the missing runners.
Another insisted no one passed that way at all. The reveal came when the searchers followed the lateral trench as far as it extended. It ended abruptly, in a massive shell crater, one so old that the water had turned stagnant and green, its sludge thick with months of debris. Men probed the crater with poles, then ropes, searching for soft patches or signs of a fall. But the crater was too deep, too still, and offered nothing. No floating equipment, no bodies, not a scrap of paper from the message they carried. Reports were forwarded up through British channels and then to the small American liaison staff. One U.S. officer admitted privately that the disappearance was an unsettling precedent, noting in his report, "Our runners are trained to remain on marked lines. The error seems unlikely." Still, the Americans lacked authority in the sector, and the investigation yielded no firm conclusion. In modern analysis, several possibilities emerge. A sudden German trench raid is unlikely, no firing or explosions were reported, and the front was comparatively stable that afternoon. A collapse of the uncharted lateral trench is possible, but again, why no debris or sign of disturbance? Another theory is that Lowell and Merritt took a wrong turn in thick smoke and inadvertently crossed into ground overlooked by British patrols, ground that may have contained hidden cavities from earlier mining operations. But without evidence, these theories remain speculative. What we do know is that the disappearance of Lowell and Merritt shook the American liaison team. For the first time, they confronted the possibility that the Western Front might consume men not only in open battle, but in ways impossible to categorize or explain. Their case became another quiet note in a growing pile of unanswered questions. Questions shared among those who had heard similar stories from Ypres, Festerbout, and Neuve Chapelle. And as summer advanced across the Somme, new mysteries would follow, some involving British engineers, others involving stretcher bearers and collapsing trenches that seemed to hide more than just earth.
By late 1917, the Western Front had become a fractured landscape of mud, timber, and tangled trench systems that defied logic even to the men who lived within them. The Battle of Passchendaele, fought through one of the wettest summers on record, had turned the Flanders region into a watery grave. But amid the artillery barrages and ceaseless attrition, one disappearance stood out, whispered about among medical units and engineers alike: the vanishing of several British stretcher bearers who were last seen moving into a German trench line that, according to maps, simply did not continue. It was an incident that added yet another thread to the unsettling pattern forming across the Western Front. The event unfolded in October 1917, just weeks into the final phase of the Passchendaele offensive. The 7th Battalion, King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry, KOYLI, was holding a sector north of Gelluveld when heavy German counter-barrages struck their forward positions. Cries for medical assistance echoed through the mud-choked shell holes. Among those responding were 4 stretcher bearers: Privates Harold Minton, Arthur Dykes, Samuel Fenwick, and George Kerrigan. These men were not combat soldiers, but trained lifesavers, accustomed to entering contested ground under fire. Their objective was to reach a reported casualty near a collapsed sap that the British believed connected to an abandoned German trench network. The bearers departed shortly after dawn, navigating what was essentially a swamp, mud so deep it pulled boots from feet, and water that concealed sharp timber and broken duckboards. Yet the men pressed forward, guided by shouted directions and the rough trench outlines half buried beneath silt. The struggle for the bearers was the landscape itself. In Passchendaele, trenches didn't just collapse, they dissolved. Entire sections slid into sludge overnight. Maps were updated constantly, but even the newest diagrams struggled to keep pace with the shifting mire. As the 4 men advanced, witnesses later recalled seeing them step into a shallow trench line that angled eastward, toward what was once a German forward dugout known as Langemark Redoubt. The trench looked intact, or as intact as anything could look in Passchendaele. But that trench, according to British engineers, should have ended in a collapsed section barely 15 meters in. Beyond that point was supposed to be nothing but boggy ground. The stretcher bearers were never seen again.
When the casualty they had been heading toward was evacuated by another team hours later, officers realized the original party had not returned. A search patrol from the Royal Engineers was assembled. Their work was methodical, despite the mud that clung to every movement. They traced the bearer's path back to the suspected trench. It was exactly as witnesses described: a partially flooded communication trench, reinforced with German timber supports and lined with rotting sandbags. But past the 15-meter mark, where earlier maps showed a complete collapse, the trench did not end. Instead, it continued. The reveal came when engineers stepped into the extension and discovered that the tunnel-like trench abruptly sealed off in a wall of soupy earth. No bodies, no stretchers, no torn uniforms. What they expected to be a collapsed dugout became instead a dead end, with no sign men had been trapped inside. Intrigued and alarmed, the engineers began excavating. They worked in shifts, hauling out mud in wooden crates, dangerous work in a sector where undermined soil could collapse without warning. They dug down 2 feet, then 3, then nearly 6. Yet not a single trace of the missing bearers appeared. One engineer, Corporal Ellis Moran, noted in his report, "Supports intact, no timber break, no air pocket collapse. Shows signs of old tunneling beyond, but no accessible cavity." His remarks hinted at a possibility some officers had quietly considered, that the German trench line may have once connected to deeper mining tunnels long since abandoned or sealed by flooding. But if the bearers had fallen into a hidden shaft, why were their stretchers and equipment not recovered? Why no disturbance in the trench walls? Why no cries for help heard by the dozens of soldiers working nearby? Eyewitness statements only clouded the picture. One rifleman swore he saw movement farther down the trench where none should have existed. Another insisted that the bearers appeared to hesitate, looking left or right before proceeding into the deeper section. A third claimed he heard a dull cracking sound around the time the bearers vanished, though he could never identify its origin. The British medical services were deeply troubled. Stretcher bearers were considered essential personnel. Their loss prompted scrutiny from brigade headquarters. A review of German prisoner interrogations produced nothing. No reports of captured medical teams, no news of raids, no evidence of enemy involvement at all. Modern historians examining the case point toward terrain instability as the most logical explanation. Passchendaele mud was notorious for swallowing horses, carts, and sometimes entire squads. It is possible that the men stepped into a waterlogged cavity so deep and soft that it engulfed them within seconds. Yet even this scenario fails to explain the absence of equipment. Stretchers, medical packs, helmets, at least some items should have been found. The incident remains one of the most perplexing personnel losses connected to the 1917 Passchendaele operations. It strengthened fears already circulating among British troops, that some sectors of the front seemed to erase men without trace. And as reports traveled up command channels, officers took note. This was the third unexplained disappearance in under 2 years. And soon, another disappearance, this time involving both U.S. and British troops, would deepen the mystery even further.
As winter settled across the Western Front in late 1917, the mud of Passchendaele hardened into a brittle crust, and the bitter winds sweeping through the Cambrai sector carried the sharp scent of frost and cordite. Yet, even as the landscape shifted from sludge to frozen earth, the disappearances did not stop. The next incident, one involving a joint U.S.-British liaison patrol south of Cambrai, became one of the most quietly debated mysteries within the intelligence circles of both armies. What made this case especially troubling was that signals had been sent from the missing men only minutes before they vanished, and those signals mentioned something unusual, something felt rather than seen. The event unfolded on December 8, 1917, during the aftermath of the Battle of Cambrai. The British had launched the offensive weeks earlier, using tanks in large numbers for the first time, but German counterattacks had since regained much of the lost ground. The sector was tense. Trenches shifted hands, outposts were lightly held, and nighttime reconnaissance had become critical for both sides. To maintain coordination, small American liaison detachments shadowed British patrols, learning trenchcraft and relaying tactical observations back to their training staff. That night, a three-man U.S. liaison element, Sergeant Michael Rayner and Privates Fritz Dodson and Lane Harrow, joined a four-man British patrol from the 2nd Battalion Essex Regiment. Their assignment was routine: inspect a suspected German sap undermining part of the British line and confirm whether enemy engineers were preparing demolition. The sap lay near a shallow depression known as Rifle Basin, a quiet stretch usually disturbed only by artillery fire. The struggle began as soon as they stepped forward. The ground was unstable. Freeze-thaw cycles had created hollow pockets under the crusted surface, making every step uncertain. The darkness was oppressive. Clouds blocked the moon, and even the faint glow of distant flares seemed swallowed by the night. Still, the patrol advanced cautiously, maintaining whispered communication. At 23:40 hours, Rayner transmitted their progress back to the Essex forward post using a compact trench telephone reel. His last recorded message was simple: ground shaking again. Same vibration as earlier. Investigating. It was the mention of vibration that caught the attention of British command later. Mining operations were common around Cambrai, but the vibrations described were not consistent with a German camouflet or counter-9 blast. They came intermittently, faint but noticeable, like a long, slow tremor running beneath the surface. 15 minutes later, at 23:55, the liaison telephone crackled once, then went dead. This did not initially alarm the forward post. Lines failed constantly, cut by frost, shell fragments, or simple tension on the cable. But when the patrol failed to return by 1 a.m., a larger concern grew. By 2:10 a.m., Lieutenant Arthur Beckwith of the Essex Regiment ordered a search party to advance toward Rifle Basin. The reveal came with disturbing swiftness. The searchers found the telephone cable lying neatly along the trench floor, undamaged. It reached a point roughly 20 meters from the suspected German sap, and then stopped abruptly, as though cut with deliberation. There were no signs of struggle, no footprints beyond the frozen impressions left earlier by the patrol, and no broken ground that suggested a sudden collapse. The sap itself appeared partially caved in, but not recently. The collapse showed no fresh soil, no warm steam rising from within, and no displaced timbers. A quiet, settled ruin, not the violent aftermath of a newly detonated mine. The patrol had not entered it. The frozen crust atop the collapse was unbroken. The baffled search team expanded their sweep. They probed cavities with bayonets, checked shell holes, and called quietly into depressions. But the night returned only silence. At 5 a.m., one of the searchers reported hearing a faint metallic clink, like a shovel striking a support beam, but the sound was never repeated, and no evidence was found in that direction. British engineers arrived at first light. They examined the ground for mining activity, but discovered no German tunnels running toward Rifle Basin. Logs recovered after the war from German pioneer battalions operating in that area make no mention of new digging operations on December 8th. No mines were planned, no shafts extended. The area had been dormant since late November. American officers reviewing the case later wondered whether the vibrations felt by Rayner might have been natural, ground settling beneath the frost, or distant artillery reverberating through frozen soil. But such explanations still failed to account for the total absence of physical evidence. If the patrol had fallen into a hidden cavity, the frozen crust should have fractured. If they had been ambushed, the attackers left no shell casings, footprints, or blood. If they had been captured, the Germans never reported it, and both armies kept careful records of POWs. One detail, however, remained the strongest point of confusion. the cleanly severed telephone wire. If the line had snapped under tension, frayed ends would have been visible. But the cut appeared precise, almost surgical. Investigators debated whether the patrol had intentionally cut the line. Yet why would they? And if they had, why did they not return? Modern historians revisiting the case interpret it as a combination of terrain hazards and wartime miscommunication. Frozen soil can mask deep fissures, and a patrol moving silently in the dark could easily step into a deadly void. But even those who endorse this theory admit that the absence of debris or surface collapse challenges the theory. By the spring of 1918, the Allied armies on the Western Front were exhausted, stretched thin by years of attrition and unrelenting bombardment. When the Germans launched Operation Michael on March 21, the opening blow of the spring offensive, the British lines trembled under the sudden shock of stormtrooper infiltration tactics, rolling barrages, and choking fog. In this chaos, entire units were overrun, communication shattered, and supply routes cut within minutes. Yet even amid this large-scale collapse, the disappearance of a single platoon from the British 47th London Division stood out as something fundamentally different, an event that defied even the wartime explanations of confusion, retreat, or capture. For when the fog lifted and positions were re-established, not a single trace of the platoon could be found. The incident occurred on March 24, 1918, near the village of Bugmi, an area hammered by German advances during the first 3 days of the offensive. The 7th Battalion of the 47th Division was conducting a fighting withdrawal, attempting to slow the enemy long enough to form a new defensive line west of the village. In this sector, visibility was reduced to mere meters as banks of thick, pale fog rolled across the fields, mixing with smoke from incendiary shells. That morning, No. 12 Platoon, 32 men under the command of Lieutenant Charles Redford, was ordered to hold a shallow communication trench nicknamed Sparrow Line, while the rest of the company reorganized to the rear. The struggle was immediate. Sparrow Line was barely a trench at all, more a shallow depression reinforced by a few broken planks. German stormtroopers, armed with light machine guns and grenades, were known to move like shadows through the fog, bypassing strong points to strike weak links in the line. Redford and his men understood the danger. Their final wireless transmission, sent at 0817 hours, conveyed tension but not panic. Fog heavy, hearing movement to the flanks, holding position. Less than 20 minutes later, attempts to re-establish contact failed. By midday, when the fog briefly thinned, British forces attempted to pull back No. 12 Platoon. Runners sent to retrieve them found Sparrow Line empty. No bodies, no rifles or helmets scattered from a fight, no signs of trench bombing or close combat. The earth was undisturbed, the planks in place, and the muddy parapet still intact. One runner, Private Harold Lowton, later described the scene in his debriefing. It was too still, not even the usual churn from boots, as though no one had stood there all morning. A German overrun seemed the most logical explanation at first. Units from the 17th Reserve Division were operating in the vicinity, and fast-moving stormtroopers could conceivably have struck the trench, captured the platoon, and pushed forward before the fog lifted. But problems soon emerged. Prisoner rolls compiled by the Germans after Operation Michael's initial successes made no mention of capturing 32 men from the 47th Division. Propaganda leaflets did not boast of it, and when British intelligence interrogated POWs weeks later, none recalled an engagement at Sparrow Line that resulted in mass surrender. British officers considered the possibility that the platoon had attempted to retreat on its own initiative, becoming lost in the fog and drifting into enemy lines. This theory held weight. Visibility was poor, German infiltration widespread. Yet here too, the evidence failed to align. Searchers found no footprints leading away from the trench, only the frozen, churned impressions from earlier that morning. They found no discarded equipment, no sign of hurried movement through the mud, and no wounded stragglers attempting to make their way back. The reveal came when a combat engineer team swept the trench later that evening. While probing the northern edge, they discovered a narrow drainage culvert partially concealed by a collapsed section of earth. It descended roughly 3 feet before leveling out into a cramped passage, barely wide enough for a man to crawl through. It was old, likely part of a French farm drainage system built years before the war. The opening was too small for a mass movement of 30 men, and there were no signs it had been used recently. No fresh mud scraped from boots, no broken timbers, no disturbed soil. It was a curiosity, but not an explanation. Investigators then turned to the battle conditions. That morning, a German rolling barrage had struck just north of Sparrow Line. The ground shook violently. Some officers wondered if a tremor had caused a collapse under the platoon's position. But once again, the earth offered no answers. There was no depression, no cave-in, no change in the contour of the trench. A collapse capable of swallowing 32 men would have left unmistakable evidence: timber breaks, fresh soil displacement, and the distinctive scent of upturned earth. In the absence of physical clues, soldiers began to quietly speculate. Some believed the men had been cut off and wiped out somewhere further east, their remains later buried by shellfire. Others whispered that the fog had simply erased them, that in the chaos of the retreat, they had been forgotten, their last footsteps lost in the mud of Bugny. But none of these theories accounted for the intact trench, the undisturbed earth, or the complete absence of material evidence. Modern historians examining the disappearance consider it one of the strangest unexplained losses recorded during the spring offensive. While the fog and German infiltration tactics offer partial explanations, the total lack of physical remains remains difficult to reconcile with known battlefield dynamics. Some argue that rapid overrun followed by immediate German redeployment may have scattered or buried the platoon's traces in the shell-churned fields beyond. But even this rests on speculation. For the 47th Division, the disappearance of No. 12 Platoon became a quiet scar, overshadowed by the larger disaster of the spring offensive, but remembered by those who served alongside them. It would not be the last mysterious loss of the war, but it would stand as the last major disappearance before the armistice. And in the war's final year, as commanders tried to make sense of the growing list of unexplained vanishings, one final investigation would attempt to connect these scattered events into a single, troubling pattern. By the final year of the Great War, Allied command was contending not only with the relentless grind of battle, but also with a series of personnel losses that defied conventional explanation. In the shadows of the major offensives, Somme, Passchendaele, Cambrai, the Spring Offensive, 5 separate disappearance incidents had quietly entered official logs, each dismissed at the time as an unfortunate wartime irregularity. But by late 1918, as the front lines stabilized once again and the German advance began to falter, senior officers in British intelligence began to notice patterns that frontline units had been whispering about for years. Disappearances that left no bodies, patrols that vanished without combat, trenches where gear remained but men did not. And so, as the war neared its end, a small team of officers set out to piece together what could be reconstructed from the fragments left behind. The investigation was informal at first. Notes exchanged between battalion adjutants, quiet discussions over maps in dimly lit dugouts, snippets of trench gossip that drifted across brigade lines. But by October 1918, with the Allied advance pushing steadily eastward, the British Fourth Army authorized a more deliberate review of unusual personnel losses since 1916. It wasn't a formal inquiry. The High Command had no appetite for dwelling on mysteries when victory seemed within reach. But for officers who had lived through the chaos, it was a chance to understand what the daily casualty reports never revealed. The struggle lay in the nature of the Western Front itself. Trenches shifted, collapsed, were rebuilt, abandoned, and retaken. Maps evolved daily. Locations that played host to disappearances, Ypres, Coton-Maison, Passchendaele, Cambrai, Bugny had since changed hands multiple times, their terrain warped by thousands of shells. Investigators often found themselves standing on ground that bore no resemblance to its state during the incidents. A trench that had once been shoulder deep was now a shallow groove. A sap that once extended 50 meters had been obliterated entirely. In more than one case, investigators stood atop ground that had already been churned repeatedly by artillery, burying any evidence that may have once existed. Despite these challenges, certain patterns began to emerge. One central insight came from a lieutenant in the Royal Engineers who reviewed earlier engineer logs from the Passchendaele sector. He noted that in nearly every disappearance case, the terrain featured some form of structural instability, mining remnants, collapsed saps, or battle-scarred earth riddled with hidden cavities. Another officer pointed out that 3 of the incidents involved mixed units, or liaison teams, suggesting that unfamiliarity with specific trench layouts may have played a subtle role. But these factors still fail to account for the complete lack of physical remains. Even in the worst collapses, bodies were usually recovered, or fragments of equipment at the very least. The reveal from the investigation was stark. No single explanation fit all 5 events. The Ypres listening patrol had vanished with their rifles neatly stacked, suggesting an orderly departure rather than a collapse. The Somme runners had disappeared on stable ground with no sign of shelling. The Passchendaele stretcher bearers had entered a trench that should not have existed. The Cambrai liaison patrol had reported vibrations moments before disappearing, leaving behind a telephone wire severed with precision. And No. 12 platoon of the 47th Division had evaporated in fog, without a trace, in a trench that showed no sign of German attack or hurried retreat. A recurring question emerged. Were these events the result of wartime chaos, miscommunication, and terrain hazards? Or did they represent something more systematic, perhaps rooted in how information and people were lost in the confusion of trench warfare? An intelligence captain named Edmund Verro compiled the findings into a private memorandum titled Unusual Personnel Losses, Observations, and Possibilities. In it he wrote, "These cases highlight the often overlooked truth that war creates situations where evidence cannot survive. Mud shifts, shells distort ground, and lines of communication break. Yet the frequency of disappearances without physical trace suggests that we must acknowledge how little we understand about the micro-terrain of the front." Verro's memorandum included several speculations later echoed by military historians. One theory proposed that uncharted drainage channels or abandoned mines, some dating back to earlier French or German works, could have created sudden voids. Another suggested that in the shifting ground of Flanders and Picardy, collapses could occur silently, especially when saturated with groundwater. A more administrative explanation pointed to record-keeping failures. In periods of rapid retreat or advance, casualties could be misfiled, incorrectly attributed, or buried by later bombardments. But Verro also acknowledged the limitations of every theory. None explained the precise severing of communication lines, the absence of debris, or the uniformity of the silence that accompanied these losses. By November 1918, as the armistice approached, the review slowed. Officers were rotated home, units disbanded, and priority shifted to demobilization. The disappearance cases were quietly archived in battalion war diaries, overshadowed by the overwhelming losses of the war as a whole. Modern historians with access to expanded archives have tried to revisit the events, but the Western Front changed so drastically in the decades after the war that direct evidence is now impossible to recover. What remains instead are fragments, diaries, map overlays, engineering notes, and first-hand testimonies that paint a mosaic of confusion, danger, and unresolved uncertainty. The 5 disappearance cases are now regarded as some of the most perplexing unsolved episodes of the First World War. They reflect both the complexity of trench warfare and the limits of human perception during conflict. No grand conspiracy, no supernatural explanation, only the stark reminder that in the largest land war Europe had ever seen, entire stories could vanish as completely as the men who lived them. These cases continue to raise questions not about the enemy, but about the battlefield itself. And while the Great War ended more than a century ago, the mysteries left behind still whisper through the mud and fractured timber of the old Western Front, unresolved and forever part of its haunted history.